He thought he was putting on a show, but the woman he laughed at was about to change the rest of his life. The heat that afternoon sat heavy over the street like a sheet of iron, the kind of late summer heat that made the sidewalk shimmer and turned every parked car into a mirror of white light. Danielle Brooks stood near the city bus bench with one hand wrapped around the strap of her worn leather bag, her shoulders tired from a double shift, her navy work shirt still carrying the faint scent of paper, coffee, and old air conditioning from the legal aid office downtown. She had spent the day helping people no one important ever seemed to see: single mothers, laid-off workers, veterans trying to understand forms that looked like they had been written to make failure feel official. And now all she wanted was 10 quiet minutes, a bus ride home, and maybe enough energy left to call her older sister before the night disappeared. Across the curb, Officer Travis Cole leaned against his patrol car like the whole block belonged to him, mirrored sunglasses cutting his face into something colder than it needed to be, one hand hooked near his belt, the other holding a hose attachment he had no reason to be playing with. He had already looked Danielle over twice with that familiar kind of smirk, the kind built from habit, the kind that expected silence from people it judged in a single glance. Around them, the city moved in fragments, a delivery truck idling at the red light, a teenager balancing a drink tray out of a corner store, a mother adjusting the strap of her daughter's backpack, a radio somewhere playing a muffled old R&B song that almost softened the air until Travis laughed and broke the moment open. "You look a little too comfortable there," he called out, loud enough for strangers to hear, his voice carrying that lazy cruelty people used when they wanted an audience more than an answer. Danielle lifted her eyes slowly, not startled, just careful, and in that second the sun flashed across a shallow puddle near the curb and painted a moving band of light over her shoes. She didn't say anything. She had learned a long time ago that some men mistook stillness for weakness and quiet for surrender. Travis grinned wider, turned the nozzle, and sent a hard spray of water across the sidewalk in her direction, not enough to knock anyone down, but enough to soak her slacks, drench the side of her bag, and scatter the papers she had tucked under her arm into damp, curling sheets against the concrete. A few people gasped. One man muttered, "Come on, man," under his breath. The little girl by the bench froze with her hand around a pink lunchbox, her eyes wide, as if she had just watched the world break one rule too many. Danielle closed her eyes for half a heartbeat as the water hit, then opened them again with her chin raised, drops sliding from her hairline to her jaw, her breathing steady, her expression unreadable in a way that suddenly made the whole sidewalk feel quieter than before. Travis expected anger. He expected shouting, maybe tears. What he got instead was a woman standing perfectly straight in wet clothes beneath a merciless sky, looking at him as if she had already measured the distance between power and dignity and decided which one would still matter when the sun went down. Danielle did not move right away. Water clung to the ends of her hair and darkened the fabric of her shirt, but there was something in the way she stood that made the moment feel less like humiliation and more like a line being drawn where everyone could see it. Around her, the block slowly found its breath again. A city bus roared past the intersection without stopping, pushing a gust of diesel heat over the curb. Somewhere behind her, a shopping cart rattled across cracked pavement. The little girl near the bench leaned closer to her mother, still staring at Danielle as if she had expected the woman to collapse into anger and could not understand why she had not. Danielle bent down and began collecting the papers that had slid across the sidewalk. She handled each page with calm, even when the corners had gone soft from the water. Intake forms, housing notices, benefit appeals, names of people whose entire futures could swing on one signature, one date, one hearing that no one in power thought mattered until it was their own. She stacked the pages against her palm, pressed them gently against the side of her leather bag, and for a second the smell of wet paper rose into the heat, sharp and clean, taking her somewhere far from that street. It brought back the tiny apartment where she grew up on the east side, where the summer air came through a rusted screen and her mother used to iron church clothes while legal envelopes sat unopened on the kitchen table because nobody in that home had the luxury of pretending systems were fair. Danielle had been 14 the first time she realized that dignity was not something the world handed out evenly. It was something you had to carry for yourself, even when your hands were full, even when people with louder voices try to strip it from you in public and call it a joke. She had carried it through community college classes taken at night, through years of work that paid too little and demanded too much, through the long fluorescent evenings at the legal aid office where she learned to read not just contracts and complaints, but faces, pauses, silences, and the exact second a room changed temperature because truth had entered it. She was the woman people underestimated because she did not advertise what she knew. She listened more than she spoke. She wore practical shoes, packed her own lunch, and remembered every client's child by name. She had a way of making frightened people feel less alone, and that gift had earned her trust in rooms where titles could not. So when she rose with those damp papers in her hand, she did not look like someone defeated. She looked like someone returning to herself. Officer Travis Cole, meanwhile, still wore that loose smile, but it had begun to harden at the edges. Men like him understood tears. They understood pleading. They understood the quick satisfaction of seeing another person shrink. What they did not understand was restraint that came from strength instead of fear. Danielle looked at him once, then at the little girl by the bench, then back at the patrol car shining under the sun. Her bag, soaked on one side, hung heavier now against her shoulder, but she adjusted it without complaint. In the distance, thunder murmured somewhere beyond the city, too far away to cool anything yet. The afternoon remained bright, exposed, merciless. And standing there in wet clothes with the taste of heat and metal in the air, Danielle Brooks seemed to realize the same thing. The street was only beginning to learn. Travis Cole had not chosen the wrong woman because she was loud or powerful or impossible to control. He had chosen the wrong woman because he had mistaken kindness for fragility, and he was about to learn the difference. Officer Travis Cole had spent so many years being obeyed that he no longer heard the difference between authority and cruelty. On paper, he looked respectable enough to people who only trusted uniforms from a distance. Mid-30s, broad shoulders, regulation haircut, polished badge, steady record, the kind of man neighborhood newsletters called dedicated and local television stations described as experienced whenever they needed a face to stand beside flashing lights and official statements. But men were rarely what their photographs suggested, and Travis had built an entire life inside that gap. He liked control in its smallest forms, the kind that did not make headlines but still left marks on a day. He liked deciding who had to wait, who had to explain themselves twice, who got spoken to with courtesy, and who got spoken over. He liked the public theater of it, the little performances that let him remind strangers that he could turn an ordinary afternoon into something tense with a few words and the right tone. His power had never needed to be dramatic to satisfy him. In fact, he preferred it casual, almost playful, because that made it easier to deny later. He could laugh and call it routine. He could smirk and say people were too sensitive. He could stand under the protection of procedure while doing things that had nothing to do with service and everything to do with ego. The block knew that kind of man, even if it did not always say his name out loud. The barber 2 storefronts down had seen him stop young black men for questions that led nowhere. The owner of the corner store had watched him become warmer, lighter, almost neighborly whenever a white couple asked for directions. The crossing guard on Elm had noticed that Travis loved an audience, especially the kind that would not challenge him. To some people, he was simply another officer doing his job. To others, he was the reason they lowered their eyes, kept receipts in easy reach, and taught their children to make themselves small around official voices. Today he had chosen Danielle, because she fit the pattern he trusted most. A black woman alone, tired from work, carrying too much, standing in the wrong place at the wrong time beneath a sun that made everyone impatient. He had read her in one lazy glance and decided she belonged in the category he understood best, the one marked harmless, the one marked easy. What he did not know, what he had never bothered to imagine, was that Danielle was reading him too. While he stood there with his fingers resting near his belt and that fading smile on his face, she was taking in the details he had spent years arranging into a disguise. The extra confidence in his posture because his partner was nowhere nearby. The way he kept looking around after every word, not out of caution but out of hunger for reaction. The faint stain of arrogance that clung to every sentence, as unmistakable as cologne in summer heat. Even the little pauses before he spoke, as if waiting for the world to lean toward him. Travis mistook himself for untouchable because too many people had let his version of events become the official one. Yet standing under that hard white sun with wet papers in her hand, Danielle could already sense what lay beneath him. Not strength, not discipline, not honor, but a man who had relied for too long on the belief that the people he humiliated would never be the people who could expose him. Danielle saw the shift before anyone else did. It happened in the smallest way, in the angle of Travis Cole's mouth when he realized she was not going to give him the scene he wanted. The laugh he had been wearing started to look forced, as if it needed the crowd more than it wanted the moment. A man like Travis fed on reaction. Anger gave him something to push against. Fear gave him room to grow louder. But Danielle offered him neither, and that unsettled him more than any raised voice could have. The mother at the bench tightened her grip on her daughter's shoulder and took half a step back, trying to create space without appearing to flee. The child, Ava, still watched Danielle with those wide, searching eyes children had when they sensed an adult truth before they had words for it. The air felt hotter now, heavier, as if the whole block had been sealed under glass. A siren moaned somewhere far off, then faded. Travis adjusted his stance and spoke again, louder this time, performing confidence for the phones he now noticed were pointed in his direction. He asked Danielle what was in the bag like he had some urgent reason to know, though his tone made clear that the question was never about safety. It was about ownership, about turning her private things into public spectacle. Danielle looked at him, then at Ava, then down at the damp leather bag against her side. She knew exactly what kind of afternoon this was trying to become. She also knew how quickly a stranger's cruelty could become a child's memory. So instead of stepping back from Travis, she moved slightly to the side, placing herself between the nozzle in his hand and the bus bench where Ava stood frozen. It was not a dramatic gesture. That was what made it powerful. It was quiet, instinctive, and unmistakably protective. For one brief second, the expression on Ava's face changed from fear to surprise, as if she had not expected the woman everyone had just watched being mocked to think first about someone smaller than herself. Danielle's wet sleeve clung to her arm as she squared her shoulders and said, in a voice so steady it seemed to cool the air by a degree, that there was no reason for him to keep turning this into something ugly. She did not plead. She did not challenge him in the way he expected. She simply named what he was doing, and in naming it, she stripped away the game. Travis smiled again, but now it looked thinner, sharpened by irritation. Men like him could tolerate many things, but not being seen clearly. He took a step closer, trying to reclaim the rhythm, trying to crowd the silence with his presence. Yet the street was no longer fully his. Too many eyes were on him. Too many people had stopped pretending not to notice. Danielle could feel it in the stillness gathering around them, in the hush that falls when strangers begin to understand that they are witnessing the moment before something changes. Her papers were still damp in her hand, the ink beginning to blur at the edges, but her voice remained calm. She told Ava and her mother, without taking her eyes off Travis, that they should stand a little farther back from the curb because the pavement was slick. It was such an ordinary, gentle sentence that it landed harder than anger would have. Even now, even standing in soaked clothes under the glare of a man trying to shame her in public, Danielle Brooks was choosing care over humiliation, order over panic, dignity over theater. And that was the first moment Travis Cole made the mistake that would undo him, because he looked at her kindness and decided it meant she could still be pressed further. The smile left Travis Cole's face in pieces, not all at once, but enough for the people watching to notice that something in him had turned impatient. He had expected Danielle to shrink after being singled out in public. He had expected the crowd to drift back into its own concerns, the way crowds usually did when power put on a uniform and called itself normal. Instead, the phone stayed up. The mother near the bench kept her daughter close, but did not leave. A man by the corner store folded his arms and remained where he was. Even the afternoon seemed to hold itself still, as though the heat rising off the pavement had become a sheet of glass laid over the block. Travis glanced around and saw what Danielle had already understood. The performance was no longer under his control. That was when he reached for her bag. Not with urgency, not with any believable reason, but with the irritated entitlement of someone trying to reassert ownership over a moment that had begun slipping away from him. His fingers closed around the strap, and the bag jerked sideways. Danielle tightened her grip at once, not yanking, not struggling, just holding on with quiet firmness. The wet leather creaked between their hands. Her papers, already softened from the water, shifted against her arm and slid loose again, drifting down in pale sheets that landed near the curb and soaked up the dirty water pooled there. A low murmur moved through the people watching. Travis said something sharp about needing to inspect the contents, but the words rang hollow in the open air. Nothing in his voice sounded official anymore. It sounded personal. Danielle looked down at the papers scattered around her feet, and for one brief second the hurt touched her face, not because of the pages themselves, but because she knew exactly what they represented. Eviction notices waiting for signatures. Case summaries for people who had trusted her to carry their stories carefully. Court dates. Names. Small lives balanced on paper that was now going limp at the edges under the August sun. Still, she did not give him anger. She crouched slowly, one hand still on the bag, and began gathering the pages again, smoothing each one as best she could with her palm. Her composure did something strange to the street. It made Travis look louder than he was. It made every impatient gesture of his seem thinner, more exposed. He kept talking, trying to fill the silence she refused to break, but each sentence seemed to land worse than the one before. He called her suspicious. He asked why she had so many documents. He implied that a woman like her had no business carrying anything important. The words were ugly in the particular way ugliness becomes when it is dressed as authority and spoken like it should not need to explain itself. Danielle heard every bit of it, and yet the thing that reached her most deeply was not his tone. It was Ava. The little girl stood beside her mother with her lunchbox hanging from one hand, staring at Danielle as if waiting to learn what a person was supposed to do when someone tried to make them feel small in front of everybody. Danielle could not protect the papers from water that had already touched them, and she could not stop Travis from revealing himself to the block one sentence at a time. But she could control what came next. She rose again, damp pages stacked against her chest, and looked at Travis with a steadiness that no longer carried even a trace of confusion. There was pain in the moment, yes, an insult, and the exhaustion of being forced once again to stand inside another person's prejudice. But there was also something else now, something colder and clearer than either anger or fear. Travis had crossed past mockery into exposure, and Danielle knew, with the absolute certainty of someone who had spent years recognizing the exact second a lie overreached itself, that he had just stepped over a line he would not be able to step back from. For the first time since. The afternoon had cracked open. Nobody spoke. The city was still there, of course, but it seemed to pull back from the curb and wait. Traffic rolled through the far end of the intersection in a blur of sunlight and chrome. A construction hammer tapped somewhere 3 blocks away. The bus shelter glass gave back a warped reflection of heat, uniforms, handbags, and faces turned toward the same narrow stretch of sidewalk. But around Danielle, the air had gone hushed in that strange way it does when a moment stops belonging to noise and starts belonging to consequence. Water continued to slip from the edge of her sleeve, bead by bead, darkening the concrete near her shoes. One drop landed on the corner of a page she had just rescued, and the ink feathered slightly before settling. She looked at it, then at the stack in her hands, then slowly lowered herself to one knee again. There was no panic in the motion, no rush, just a deliberate quiet that made every small sound sharper. The brush of paper against paper, the faint creak of wet leather, the whisper of her breathing as she steadied herself. Sunlight leaned hard across the street now, turning every patch of standing water into a sheet of pale gold. It touched the side of Danielle's face and traced the line of her cheekbone and jaw, and for a brief second, she looked less like someone cornered than someone illuminated. Travis Cole shifted his weight a few feet away, but even that sounded uncertain now, the scrape of his shoe no longer carrying the confidence it had a minute earlier. He did not know what to do with silence that did not submit to him. Danielle did. She had lived inside silence before. She had known the silence of waiting rooms where families stared at floor tiles while bad news moved through closed doors. She had known the silence of courthouse hallways before a hearing, the silence of kitchens where overdue notices sat under magnets on refrigerators, the silence that settled over tired people when they were deciding whether to keep hoping. This silence was different. This one had shape. This one was gathering itself. Ava, still by the bench, no longer looked frightened so much as intent, as if she understood that something important was happening in the gap between what a powerful man expected and what a dignified woman refused to give him. Danielle gathered the last damp page and rose with care, keeping the stack pressed against her chest. Her blouse clung cool against her skin now that the first shock of the water had passed, and a light breeze finally moved down the block, carrying the scent of rain from somewhere beyond the city limits. It touched the loose strands at her temple and lifted them slightly before disappearing. Danielle closed her eyes for the briefest instant and let herself take one full breath. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Measured, controlled. When she opened her eyes again, the softness was gone, replaced by something steadier and more exact. She set the papers inside the dry inner compartment of her bag one by one, shielding them with her body, then let her hand remain there for a moment longer than necessary. Travis watched that hand. So did everyone else. It was only a hand disappearing into a rain-lined pocket of leather, a simple, ordinary motion on an ordinary street. But the stillness around it changed. The block seemed to lean in. Even the little girl stopped fidgeting. Danielle's fingers closed around something inside the bag, and when she looked up at Travis again, the expression in her eyes held no anger at all. That was what made it so final. She was not reaching for revenge. She was reaching for truth, and somewhere deep beneath his badge and posture and practiced voice, Travis Cole felt it before he understood it. Danielle drew her hand from the inner compartment of the bag with such calm precision that the movement itself seemed to quiet the street even further. Between her fingers was not panic, not a phone waved wildly for protection, not anything dramatic enough to satisfy the appetite of the crowd. It was a leather credential wallet, dark and understated, the kind of object that looked almost ordinary until it opened. She flipped it once, smoothly, and the badge inside caught the afternoon light in a hard, clean flash. Not city issue. Not decorative. Official in the unmistakable way real authority always was. Then she held up the identification beside it, and the color changed in Travis Cole's face so quickly that even the people several yards away could see it. Danielle Brooks, Special Investigator, Civilian Oversight and Public Integrity. Task Force. Beneath the title sat her photograph, composed and unsmiling, and below that, the seal of the state office that had spent the last 11 months reviewing complaints too often dismissed as misunderstandings. No one around them spoke. Even the traffic noise seemed to thin. Travis stared first at the badge, then at her face, then back at the badge as though repetition might somehow change what he was seeing. Danielle did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She simply reached into the wallet again and withdrew a folded document protected in a clear waterproof sleeve. The paper crackled softly as she opened it. When she turned it toward him, he saw his own name before he saw anything else. Officer Travis Cole. Formal notice of administrative review. Attached order pending service. The date was today. The unit had planned to make contact later that week, quietly, through channels that preserved process and gave his department room to cooperate. But there, under the glare of late afternoon and the cold witness of a dozen phone cameras, the process had caught up to him in a way no one could have staged better if they had tried. Danielle's voice, when it came, was low and even. She said that multiple complaints had already placed him under investigation for discriminatory conduct, misuse of public authority, and repeated violations of departmental standards. She said that until 3 minutes ago, the file had been serious. Now it was complete. The words landed with almost no force, and that made them devastating. Travis opened his mouth as if to object, but nothing useful came out. His swagger vanished first, then his posture, then that practiced expression that had always helped him glide through uncomfortable questions. In its place came something smaller and far more honest. Disbelief struggling against fear. He looked around as though the block might rescue him, but the witnesses who had once been background to his performance were now the frame around his downfall. The man from the corner store kept recording. The mother at the bench pulled Ava slightly closer, but neither of them looked away. Danielle lifted one more item from the inner pocket of her bag, a slim black recording device no larger than a pack of gum, its indicator light glowing a steady green. She held it where Travis could see it, and then, with her other hand, lightly touched the pin at the edge of her damp collar, no larger than a shirt button, the concealed backup camera that had been transmitting since before he ever picked up the hose. Understanding hit him in layers. The public humiliation, the interference, the statements, the witnesses, the documentation. Every careless choice he had made on that sidewalk had become evidence with a timestamp. For the first time all afternoon, Travis Cole was not looking down at Danielle Brooks. He was looking up from the bottom of a hole he had dug himself, and in the terrible stillness that followed, everybody on that block could feel the exact second power changed hands. Travis Cole tried to speak before he had found a thought strong enough to stand on. His lips parted, closed, then opened again, but whatever he meant to say collapsed under the weight of the badge in Danielle Brooks's hand and the steady green light of the recorder that had already outlived his excuses. The confidence that had once sat so easily on his shoulders was gone now, peeled away in front of strangers, leaving only a man in a uniform who suddenly looked smaller inside it. He glanced toward the patrol car, toward the phones aimed at him, toward the far end of the block as if one of those directions might offer a way back into the version of the afternoon he had expected. None did. The mother at the bench kept her arm around Ava, and the little girl watched with solemn eyes that no longer held fear alone. There was understanding in them now, the first fragile shape of a lesson she would probably remember for years. Sometimes the person being humiliated is not the powerless one. Danielle folded the notice once, carefully, and slid it back into the waterproof sleeve. Her blouse was still damp. A drop of water slipped from the cuff near her wrist and darkened the dust at her feet. Yet there was nothing undone about her. She stood with the same composure she had carried when she was helping strangers fill out forms downtown. The same patience she gave frightened clients when the system tried to make them feel invisible. Travis finally found his voice, but it had changed. It was softer now, rougher around the edges, stripped of performance. He said there had been a misunderstanding. He said he did not know who she was. He said he had not meant anything by it. Each sentence landed more weakly than the one before, as if even he could hear how little truth remained in them. Danielle looked at him for a long moment, and the silence between them did more than shouting ever could. She did not gloat. She did not lean into the triumph he must have expected from someone who had just turned the ground beneath him into evidence. That restraint unsettled him more than anger would have, because anger would have let him pretend they were both carried by emotion. But Danielle was not carried by emotion. She was anchored by principle, and principle left no room for the kind of escape he was reaching for. He tried again, this time lower, asking if there was a way to handle this quietly. The words hung in the heat, like something embarrassed to exist. For a moment the street seemed to recoil from them. Quietly, after everything he had done publicly, after using humiliation like a tool because he believed no one important was watching, now he wanted privacy. Danielle's face did not harden. If anything, it grew sadder. She had heard this turn before in other voices, in offices and hearings and review rooms where people only discovered gentleness once consequences had arrived. She told him, in a tone so calm it almost sounded merciful, that the problem was never that he did not know who she was. The problem was that he believed her dignity depended on whether she had a title he respected. That sentence moved through the air and settled over the sidewalk like truth usually does, quietly, with nowhere to go once spoken. Travis lowered his eyes. Somewhere in the distance, another siren drew nearer, not urgent, just certain. Danielle continued, saying that what frightened him now was not her badge, not her office, and not even the cameras. It was the fact that for one clear afternoon, in broad daylight, he had shown everyone exactly who he was when he thought the person in front of him could not answer back. The words did not wound. They revealed. And revelation was harder to survive. The first internal affairs vehicle turned the corner at the far end of the block, dark windows flashing in the sun. Travis saw it, and his whole posture changed again, not dramatically, but in the quiet, unmistakable way a person changes when hope runs out before pride does. Danielle did not step closer. She did not need to. By then the distance between them was no longer measured in feet, but in character, and Travis Cole had finally reached the terrible edge of understanding that no badge, no title, and no practiced smile could cross it for him. The internal affairs vehicle rolled to the curb without sirens, without spectacle, without the kind of noise that had started the afternoon, and somehow that quiet arrival felt heavier than anything else that had happened on the block. A second sedan followed behind it, dark and clean, its windshield flashing once in the lowering sun before the engine cut off. No one rushed. No one raised a voice. The agents who stepped out moved with the calm certainty of people who did not need to perform authority because they actually possessed it. One of them, a woman in a charcoal jacket with a folder tucked under her arm, looked first to Danielle Brooks, then to Officer Travis Cole, then to the witnesses still standing under the fading heat with their phones in hand, and their expressions changed forever from curiosity to clarity. Danielle gave a small nod, nothing theatrical, just enough to pass the moment forward. The woman from Internal Affairs returned the nod and crossed the sidewalk with measured steps, her shoes clicking softly against the concrete still damp where the water had pooled. Travis did not move right away. He looked as though the weight of the day had settled all at once into his shoulders, bending something inside him that pride had held upright for years. The crowd did not taunt him. That was the strange mercy of it. No one laughed. No one needed to. Public shame was already there, hanging in the still warm air beside the scent of rain and wet paper. Danielle slipped the recorder back into the inner compartment of her bag and carefully checked the stack of documents one last time, straightening bent corners, pressing the pages flat against her palm with the same care she gave everything entrusted to her. A few feet away, Ava stepped out from beside her mother and looked up at Danielle with the solemn seriousness children sometimes carry when they have just seen the world reveal one of its hidden rules. Danielle met her eyes and offered a small, reassuring smile, the kind that asked for nothing and promised only this. You saw what you saw, and you were right to trust it. Ava held that smile for a second, as if storing it somewhere safe. The agents began speaking to Travis in low professional tones. He answered, but whatever was left of his old voice seemed distant now, drained of the easy arrogance that had once made him feel untouchable. Danielle did not stay to listen. She did not need the details read aloud. The truth had already finished its work. She adjusted the strap of her damp leather bag on her shoulder, tucked a loosened strand of hair behind her ear, and stepped away from the curb. The sun had lowered enough to soften from white to amber, and that warmer light moved across the windows of the buildings and caught in the puddles near her feet, turning them from dirty water into brief mirrors of gold. As she walked, the block slowly resumed its sounds. A bus sighed to a stop at the corner. Someone opened the door to the barber shop. A radio came back to life behind a screen door somewhere up the street. Ordinary life, patient and steady, returning after disorder, had finally been named. Danielle's clothes were still damp, and every few steps a cool patch of fabric brushed her skin, but the discomfort no longer mattered. She walked with the quiet rhythm of someone who had not won by humiliating another person, but by refusing to surrender her humanity when invited to. Halfway down the block, she paused just long enough to glance back once. Travis stood smaller now, framed by officials, evidence, and the long shadow of his own choices. Then Danielle turned forward again. The evening breeze arrived at last, carrying the first clean hint of rain across the city, and it lifted lightly around her as she continued down the sidewalk, past the bus bench, past the corner store, past the last shimmer of water drying under the sky. By the time she reached the intersection, the only thing left behind on that street was the silence that follows real justice, the kind that does not need applause because everyone who witnessed it can already feel what it means.